looking to have a rehash of the ABC debate here, where I know Andrew's just going to jump in like David Muir and yell at me the whole time and fact check me the whole time. So it'll be good. Now, two of my favorite people
Well,
here.
just to fact check that. That's not true. It's not true.
Two of my favorite people on my favorite platform, The Crucible here. So it'll be good to be the bad guy again, as I started my first appearance ever debating Andrew Wilson as the bad guy. So be fun to do. Look, to start with, let me just be out front of what my beliefs are. I think that culturally I'm going to agree with Jim Bob and Andrew many, many times on most issues about the importance of family values, of traditional roles of men and women, about the importance of men taking the provider role and women being great mothers and taking a supporting role and being the chief people responsible with raising children. I think that that isn't right for everyone, but that is how strong societies survive and how we should be pushing for. I think that we've gotten too materialistic as a country, and we need to strive against that materialism, and the number one hedge against that is promoting Christian values and having strong family values and ethics. So everyone out there, despite that you're all going to hate me tonight, that's fine. You should be trying to find a partner that you could be with, to have children, have many children, be very happy, and to walk a path of morality. You should be doing that. On this particular topic, though, I have to admit that my foundational beliefs of where I come from is that I'm a libertarian adjacent person. I am small government through and through. I am a minarchist. And so I am heavily critical of the government infringing on people's rights. Now, we can have a debate on what rights are and what they mean, but I think one of the fundamental things to that is people should be able to have a voice in their government, and they should not be restricted from doing so in the path of voting because of immutable characteristics. And sex, despite what many people on the left will tell you, is an immutable, unchangeable characteristic. I do not think because someone is born a female that they should not be allowed to vote, regardless if that was the way things were at the foundation of this country or not. If we want to have a discussion about should women vote, that's a different conversation as to should they be allowed to vote. If we're going to have a conversation of should there be barriers put up for everyone across all sexes or across all races or any other of immutable characteristics, so should you have to have a certain IQ? Should you have to be a landowner? Should you have to engage in military service? I'm willing to debate all of those positions, but it is not the topic of tonight. The topic of tonight surrounds the 19th Amendment and basically the core principle of should women have the right to vote. And I think it is morally incorrect to advocate for our government to take what I would consider to be an authoritarian position to say that women do not have the right to vote and have input in our system based purely on the fact that they were born a certain sex. I think there are three possible ways that we could look into this debate, and I think all three are important, and we'll see if Jim Bob agrees with me that he would like to look at these in all three ways. The first is the question of ought, or the question of should they have the right to vote in a moralistic framework without using a utilitarian framework or a pragmatic framework. This question resolves around from forget about what women would traditionally vote. They primarily vote Democrats. This is how it's looked the past 15 years. This is a question that says the values, the philosophical principle, should they be allowed to vote regardless of the outcome? And I think there's a conversation to be had there. The second question is looking at the pragmatic and utilitarian side of that. How do women vote? What would our society look like if women didn't vote? Would we have different positions on abortion? Would we have different foreign policy decisions? Would we have a stronger border? Would we have different tax decisions? I think that that's something that's worth looking at and how that would look and whether or not that would be justification enough to prevent women from voting. The third question, which I don't know that Jim Bob will want to talk about, but I think that it is massively important and why I hesitate to wade into a topic like this at this particular time is, what is the pragmatic effect of advocating for these positions, particularly some 50 days outside a massively important election? I think that there are issues right now that are incredibly important, such as mass censorship that's going to come, that'll stop great channels like The Crucible from being able to get out important family value issues, that they're able to reach thousands of people. And I think that that's only because we have fought back against authoritarian impulses to control free speech on the internet. If Kamala Harris and the establishment wins, that could be changing. And I think that it is incredibly a stupefying decision to have prominent people on our side that are advocating that women shouldn't have the right to vote in an election where clearly women are going to have the right to vote. And you may just inspire enough of them to vote against Donald Trump or to vote against populist or conservative value candidates, because they will say, listen, even if I agree with them majoritarily on the policies they're issuing, I can't vote for a party that has so many strong people within it that are seriously considering saying that I must vote against my right to vote coming in the future. So I think that Republicans often, I don't even want to use the word Republicans, good people like populists like Donald Trump and their followers often fall into the trap of not being hyper-focused on the issues that could cause us to get these short-term victories that would be necessary to get better achievement, to steer the direction in a more Christian populist direction or a more small government direction in the future, because we end up having infighting on ourselves and split the discussion in so many ways. So although I think this is an important discussion to have, and I'm happy to have it because I think Jim Bob's fantastic. He's someone I've respected for a long time. I always like Andrew and I like The Crucible. I think that the timing of it is improper. I would rather be talking about how it's important to win this election and how terrible Kamala Harris and the establishment is. But I'm happy to have this debate, and I'm hoping to convince a large portion of this audience, even if I can't convince you on point one, that morally women should have the right to vote, and point two, that I don't think the pragmatic effort of what women voting is outweighs the moral reasons why I think women should have the vote. Maybe I could convince you on that third part that maybe it's an issue that we shouldn't be hyper-focused on 30 or 50 days outside an election, because it only has the chance of causing us to lose maybe a few necessary votes that will be needed to overcome the corruption that we face in this election, to actually get an outcome that has a chance to actually have a future where we can talk about these things.
You still have a minute and a half if you want to.
Oh, yeah, I will take that minute and a half to say the following. I suspect Jim Bob wasn't having tech issues, but that he was trying to run from this debate. That's what I suspect happened. Let it also be known, although I am a rising feminist superstar, and I know I'm going to be called a simp and a lefty and a feminist and all that stuff, usually it is the largest left-wing streamer that is late. So I just want to say, maybe we got to see what Jim Bob, maybe he's a secret plant and he's advocating for taking away women's right to vote because he really wants to sabotage the populist movement. And so maybe that's what's going on here. I don't know. I'd like to send a moderator to check Jim Bob's camera setup to make sure that this wasn't a tall tale. That's it. That's the end of my time.
He did send me a DM and said that they had to finish banging his wife, Rob. I mean, that's excusable, right?
That's
all right. Jim Bob, you got 7 minutes on the clock. Go ahead when you're ready.
Okay. Well, I want to start by focusing on what I'll be attacking tonight, which is the principles of female liberation, perhaps liberation in general, as a starting point, that liberty above all. Is that actually a good position or not? When it comes to female liberation, I wonder, what is it they're being liberated from? Is it the oppressive arms of the patriarchy? Are they being liberated from the obligation to produce and raise good humans? Are they being liberated from their loving fathers who don't want them to become OnlyFans whores and cat ladies? What is it they're being freed from here? Now, I'm not only going to argue tonight that female liberation is a bad idea and produces results that aren't even preferred by my opponent, right? So the only reason the voting right now in the election is so important and so crucial and so urgent, all of the problems are actually caused by female liberation, I would argue. However, I will not be focusing on that tonight. I'm going to argue something far more fundamental. Tonight, I will argue that the female liberation is logically and practically impossible. I'm going to argue that female liberation is a lie. So, liberation itself is predicated on the idea of, well, liberty. Liberty is predicated on the idea of sovereignty and self-governance. Sovereignty and self-governance relies wholly on the threat of and the ability to apply adequate force. Like Jordan Peterson says, behind every interaction is the looming threat of male aggression. Now give me back my benzos, bitch. Now, I believe the following is a knockdown argument against female liberation. I'm actually going to bring it up on the screen and cover all your beautiful faces real. Premise one, adequate self-actualizing force is the necessary precondition to sovereignty. Premise two, sovereignty is a necessary component to liberty. Premise three, women do not possess the adequate self-actualizing force for sovereignty. Conclusion, liberty is not possible for women. Female liberation is a lie. Rob is a progressive feminist. That's the last two are entailments. So given that it's not even possible for women to be liberated, it's an apparition, it's a joke, it's a Sims game that's performed by, weaker men who think, that egalitarianism is a possibility. It's not. Now, one challenge for my opponent tonight will be convincing the audience why we should accept a political system that's rooted in a lie. Why? Is it okay to present women with a false liberty they don't actually possess? You know what happens when you give them a false sense of status? They end up like the chicks on whatever, and you've all seen them. They're living a lie. I don't think it's good for them. Another challenge my progressive feminist opponent has today is the paradox of women voting. Now, if Rob is against government expansion and tyranny, and he values liberty above all, does it make sense to defend women voting if it predominantly supports an expanding government which erodes the very thing he values? That makes no sense. And what is voting? This is a key component here. So what is voting? Voting is a way for men to produce blocks of influence in place of using their immediate brute force. It's a trade-off. When a man votes, he is forfeiting his will to power by way of immediate brute force in exchange for an ordered system of governance which is upheld by another kind of force. So simply put, when a man votes, he is trading one form of force for another. When a woman votes, what is she trading? Nothing. A man says, I will vote instead of fighting. A woman says, I will vote instead of what? Gossiping? The woman has no leverage to exchange. There's no exchange. Isn't it interesting that women forfeit nothing when she votes, and yet she can vote to erode the liberties she can't even defend? Is it interesting that a woman forfeits nothing when she votes, and she can vote to send men to war she can't even be drafted for? Should I add that the very ideals and values my opponent will appeal to throughout this debate were established by men with the use of threat of force? That out of declaration and the power, will to power, these ideals were set into motion. It was not established by an egalitarian system of the sexes, and it's not defended or enforced by an egalitarian system of the sexes. Now, my opponent, even though he's a progressive feminist, I will give him credit for how he runs his household. He runs a patriarchal, hierarchical system. It's a miniature government called the home. Everything my opponent values about his miniature government he calls a home is the fruit of its nature, which is patriarchal and hierarchical. The value of having a wife who can focus fully on raising good humans instead of working some cubicle job is not indicative of a system he's defending tonight. So it's interesting he defends the system I'm advocating for at the state or the federal level, but he lives that. He lives it in his house, but he's defending against it. Now, I don't necessarily think that women know what's best for them, but even if they did know what's best for them, they can't enforce it anyway. Any system of governance or ideology that attempts to disempower the patriarchy is feminist. My opponent holds a view that undermines his own home. My opponent is a progressive feminist. Feminism is a lie. I concede the rest of my time.
Damn. Okay. So some banger opening statements going into this. Let me remind the audience this is scheduled to be a full debate. We will be taking callers later this evening. Send in those super chats if you have questions for any of the debaters, or you just want them read when we get to the super chat section. Of course, all gifted memberships will be pulled up. And if you say something which is really fucking hilarious, but I don't think it will derail the convo, I'll pull that up on screen as well. Gentlemen, the floor is open. Let me remind you, though, before you get into it, that I expect both of you to adhere to my moderation. I don't mute people's mics. I just tell people to shut up and answer to certain points if necessary. My job is to be here to keep the conversation on track, not to interject. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. So with that, the floor is open. Gentlemen, go ahead.
I have a request. Do you mind a request? Can you put up that screenshot again, just so I can take a picture of it, and then I get the exact
other argument?
Is that fair? Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
that way you don't have to keep pulling that up. I got it.
I was going to bring that up right now. Yeah, you can. Well, actually, I could keep it up just if you want to address any of the premises to clarify anything. I would love for you to.
Okay, so the first is adequate self-actualizing force is a necessary precondition for sovereignty. So I'm not a wordsmith. I'm a very simple redneck. So let's talk through this real quick. What this is saying in a language that I would understand is I have to have the ability or I have to have the ability myself as a man to defend myself and to issue force to defend myself, my rights, etc., in order to have sovereignty. And by sovereignty, you mean in order to have rights and, ownership over myself, my property, my land, my family, right? That's
Jim Bob, you can pull that down now so they can see you. Go ahead.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just go through these real quick, and then we could obviously talk about them. Second is that sovereignty, which we already find, is a necessary component to liberty. When you're saying liberty, you just mean like freedom. Like that's how you're defining liberty there?
Yeah, freedom. I would go with your definition of freedom. That even however you describe freedom, however I describe, it still would fall that in line. It would follow that this is a necessary component.
Okay, so then I think the rest I understand, though. Female, Rob is a progressive feminist. Maybe I don't know what that means. That's fine though. So all right, if you don't mind, we could start there. We'll start with this, and then we could move on. So I think I would disagree with the first part, or I have some questions about it. So let's take the hypothetical response that there is someone who is a man, but they're wheelchair bound. They're paraplegic. Do they fall into the same definition as being a woman then, because they do not have the ability to use force to protect themselves?
Well, they wouldn't fall in line with a woman. They would be a man who would still rely on other men to uphold their liberty.
So yeah, clearly, I mean, we're not lefties. We're not saying they're actually women.
No. Even men, regardless of their condition, are still left to the mercy of other men with force.
Okay, so just to be clear then, if we're going to take that to a real world example of things that we're talking about, such as voting, should those men have the right to vote? That do not have you're paraplegic, you don't have the ability, you solely rely on other men for your defense, for the use of force. Should they have the right to vote?
No, I would take their vote from them.
So then you would only allow the vote for men that are physically capable of using force to defend themselves.
Well, if they have property and are able to defend their property, for instance, if that paraplegic can't defend his own property, right? Would you say he could?
I think there are possible ways that he could, yeah.
Well, could he in relation to how most men can defend their property?
He wouldn't defend it in the way without like massive technological assistance.
Yeah, he would need a lot of ramps and turbo boosters, right?
Hey man, Neuralink to a drone with a 30-06 might do the job, you know?
You know, I would the question of how many lists of prerequisites we can list for men, I believe would be a separate. I think it's a fair question hypothetical, but I would start with the obvious is that men in general, right? There's an average. Men in general as a category are going to be the ones upholding, enforcing, or taking over a failed government, and women will never be doing that.
Okay, so two things to say on this. One of the central arguments that I'm going to have is, as someone that believes in more of a small government and individual-centered approach to life, I think that although certainly I'm not some deranged lefty, despite what you might be saying here, I understand that there are averages. Like, for example, men on average are much physically stronger than women. We get all that. I don't have to argue that. But there are certainly exceptions to those average. And one of the problems I have with your suggestion here is because on average women aren't able to use force, that they should holistically be excluded from things like voting. But men, and that's why it's important. Okay, fair enough. That's fair. But what I'm talking about is the exceptions, because what I take umbrage with is using immutable characteristics such as sex to deny people things like their right to vote. If you want to put a threshold on, like, let's say your argument would be this: anyone who has the ability to has the physical capabilities to defend with force their property should have the right to vote. And then I could argue that certain men don't meet that threshold and certain women do.
Rob,
that's a different discussion.
Rob. Whether you think they deserve it from some sort of metaphysical virtue position is irrelevant to whether or not they can actually defend it. So you can say you have the right to this and that, but the fact is, women couldn't defend whatever they declared is theirs anyway. So it would be a lie. So what you're really asking, Rob, is can we just lie to women and say that they have the right to anything, even though they can't possibly defend anything that you're saying that they're given? So for instance, let's go back in time at the construction of your your the values and the paradigm you value so much, the Constitution, right? Even before then, this kind of talk about how to declaratively state the position of your own sovereignty. Do you think a couple of people in wheelchairs and women, if they were the ones who found the papers and the documents, do you think that they could possibly defend it?
Well, it's
Couple
a
of
difficult.
paraplegics and
I'm trying to answer as honestly as possible. Like,
Yeah.
it's difficult to think because we had different things technologically back then. But the spirit of what you're saying is certainly true. There needed to be some level of physical capabilities, and I think even more important than that, mental capability. Like the
Sure.
aggressive nature and sort of the the mentality that's a protector type mentality. I agree with all of that. The fundamental disagreement we're having right here is I don't think that we should judge people as collectives. I think we should judge people as individuals. And so if we say there are certain metrics as an individual you need to meet to have things like the right to vote, I'm open to hearing it. I might disagree with them, but what you're doing is saying we judge all women on the average and we judge men on the average.
Okay, yeah, we can do it your way too. If we selected every single woman in the United States right now, and we looked at them and we said, is she capable of defending herself and fighting against other men? And the answer is no. We can call the accumulation of all the individual ladies out there who can't defend themselves, who can't be self-sovereign, who cannot take over land or defend their own land. If we went one by one, and it turned out, Rob, that 92% of them were inadequate, that they did not possess, right, the adequate use of force to defend their own liberty, would it follow that we can maybe collectively say, women, you're not voting? If there's some freak out there, who's a woman who's just insanely strong, and she even says, listen, you don't even have to lower your standards. I'll go into the army. I'll go into the military. I'll do what it takes to fight or whatever. If that freak of nature makes their way into all these various places among men, that's an exception. I don't think there's anything wrong with building a governing system that's based on generalizations that are demonstrably true.
Okay, are you for affirmative action in the current system that's set up, like racial affirmative action?
Affirmative action, like just giving someone a job because
like
of their...
For example, I'll give a real world example. The Biden administration suggested giving farmers of color that needed help, suggested giving them money. Is that a policy you would be for?
No.
And do you think that you have a fundamental disagreement with that policy because it doesn't give based on need, but based on immutable characteristics?
Well, it's under a false assumption. So that policy is as much a lie as your policy of securing female voting, even though they exchange nothing. I wanted to go to voting right here. Did you agree with my assessment of voting?
I certainly will, but I just want to stay on this issue real quick.
No, it's irrelevant because
I don't think it is, though.
It is. How are you going to draw?
Well, let me show you. Because I think that those policies are immoral because they're based on immutable characteristics. If, however, the Biden administration would say the following: all farmers that are in X number of debt because of our lockdowns, we will give money to. And it turns out that number resulted in 99% of the people that got that money being black farmers. I'm more okay morally with that policy than saying, no, it will be based solely on race. Race is a prerequisite. I think if you share, and I would think that deep down you would share my outrage with that sort of race-based policy.
No, I'll show you why it's disanalogous. Would you like to guess how it's disanalogous before I tell you?
Well, I'm not going. Do you want me to guess what you're going to erroneously say? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Let's see. You will say, I don't know. Surprise me.
Okay, what's in question right now is not meritocracy or effort. What's in question now is a descriptive truth of reality. The descriptive truth of reality in my argument is that women do not possess the adequate self-actualizing force to defend their own liberty and sovereignty. Whereas when you look at a farmer of color, whether or not they deserve money to be a farmer or not based on their skin color isn't reducing it to the necessity. Now, for the female reference, it's about necessity. If it's the fact, if you can't change the fact, Rob, that women don't possess the self-actualizing adequate force to defend their liberty and sovereignty. You saying, oh, that's not fair, it's an immutable characteristic, is like saying it's not fair a blind person can't be a pilot.
I disagree, because I think you've already disproven your own point by saying you've already conceded that if there is a freak out there that is a woman that has the ability, from what your definition would be, the ability to use force to protect, that you're still okay excluding them because you're okay with policies based on generalizations. And so that in itself proves that you are not advocating a system of meritocracy, which again, if your argument was this, I think that anyone, you set some test up and says you have to pass this test to prove that you have self-actualizing force to be able to protect yourself, and anyone that passes it goes. And maybe 95% of men pass it and only 1% of women.
Sure.
That would at least be a meritocracy. That wouldn't be generalization.
Okay, but is the draft a meritocracy?
No.
Okay, so are you for egalitarian draft then?
No.
Why not?
I'm not. Because I think that, generally speaking, that when it comes to forcing people to go to military service in times of a crisis, that it's okay to use the generalization of the poll that we should generally pull from.
I
But
see. So,
let me finish. But
yeah.
there are certainly, we certainly look at it in an individualistic sense as well. So we don't say all men are eligible for the draft. For example, we say if there are disabilities with certain men and they're ineffective, like, you know that, right? Like, if someone's...
hold on, Rob, generally speaking, okay, they have some standards, but if it came down to it and all bodies were needed, I'm not certain they'd include the rolly guy down the ramp, but certainly people you would otherwise maybe say stay back on this. If the situation permitted, yes, the government would draft everybody and anyone who could do it, right? And you're saying, well, I'm about egalitarianism and it shouldn't be immutable characteristics. Whereas now you're saying the immutable characteristic it is to be a man, the traits to be a man, that we have thicker bones, we're stronger, we use brute force, we're more prone, we're more likely to use aggression, we're fit for war. That's an immutable characteristic. But if you were to be consistent, you would say, well, if we're going by immutable characteristics, we should draft all the women too. Just because they're women, doesn't mean they can't give it a shot or whatever. And the fact, the irony here is that if you were to open up the draft or the military to egalitarianism, you're going to weaken the force that you, Rob, need to uphold your sense of liberty and sovereignty.
I don't disagree. It's convenient for me then that I'm not opening up the draft to women. It's not an argument that I'm making. The couple points I'll make on this. One, if things got so dire that we were drafting anyone necessary, there is a chance that this insane government would be drafting women anyways. And there might even be a point where you would say, yeah, at some point maybe it would be necessary to draft able-bodied women if things were really out of hand, like we're alien, it's an Independence Day scenario where aliens are attacking and we need every available body. So that's number one. Secondly, like, there's a difference, because what we're talking about here with the draft is a situation where there is an emergency for the immediate protection, that we're forcing people to do something for the greater good, which is to protect our country. This should only be done in drastic emergency situations, which would be very rare. That's different than sort of a positive right of saying we are restricting people's positive rights based on immutable characteristics.
You're talking about a vote?
Yes. And
so
again,
you think a vote is a right?
Yeah, I think that, yes, that you should absolutely, if you are forced to be a citizen of this country and to pay taxes into it, do you think that if you're forced to pay taxes into this country that you should have a right in the direction that the country goes?
Depends. What constitutes the ability to sway how the country goes is a different argument than whether or not you think voting is a right. Now, is it possible, hypothetically, to vote to remove your vote as a right?
Yeah. Okay. Women could theoretically, we'll get to this later when I sort of get to the things.
Hold on.
It's true.
Just one at a time. So if it's the case that you can use a vote to eliminate your own vote, which is, by the way, during the suffrage, the actual association that was promoting women's voting, they actually shut down the voting and blocked the women because they were about to show up and vote against their own vote. So if it's possible even today to vote in a way that removes your own vote, and you're saying, well, I don't believe in limiting people's positions or rights based on immutable characteristics. Well, you think it's okay if you can vote their rights away based on their immutable characteristics.
I don't think it's okay. I think it would be a bad idea.
It's an entailment that voting could lead to the removal of rights. By the way, the voting bloc you see today, you've heard it a million times, Rob, the increased female voting actually votes for policies and expanded government that limits what? Your liberties. So if it's the case, Rob, that you can vote to take away what you call a right, then what the hell's a right if you can just vote it away?
Well, what's a right is a difficult question to answer, right? Because we would say that there's questions of where our rights would come from. Do they come from God? Let me ask, since you're interested in what the definition of rights are, I'll ask you, do you believe that you have any rights, and how do you define rights?
I don't really believe in rights. I believe men have duties. And if rights exist, even if I were to take a pragmatic approach of being like, okay, I kind of know what you mean by rights, it still necessitates a deontological position that needs to be grounded, which is to say, do we have a duty to secure and defend rights is not built into the description of the right itself, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so there's a meta-ethical position that grounds a duty. But from my view, if you had a Christian ethical system and all your duties were being fulfilled, the things that you call rights violation may not be consistent with how you currently see rights violation today, because duties would always supersede rights every time. For instance, if it were the case that it was a duty to limit liberty in the short term, and you used your voting method that you're defending, women coming in and voting, they can hypothetically and have voted in a way that removes your rights temporarily or something like this. So this is why I'm confused that if the thing you're defending is a thing called a right that can't be removed based on immutable characteristics, and yet you can vote on removing that thing based on immutable characteristics, I'm not sure what it is in the metaphysics you're actually defending that somehow stands above and supersedes the very methods you're appealing to, in this case, voting.
What I'm saying, so I'll explain. I think that the default position, I'm not an anarcho-capitalist, I'm not a complete libertarian. So my belief is that the role of government is this, that it should be as minimal as possible. When I say rights, I'm saying each person has the right to the best of their ability to control their own life until it negatively infringes in a direct way on other people's lives. So I have the right to shove shitty fast food burgers in my mouth if I want. The government should not be allowed to come in and say, you can't eat those shitty fast food burgers. There are emergency situations that have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis where sometimes those rights could be temporarily restricted. Let's take disease, like things like COVID. Obviously, the restrictions are the pandemic. Obviously, the restrictions under the pandemic were gross, overreach, disgusting. I argued against them the whole time.
Would you call them feminine?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
they were authoritarian and feminine, of course, right? Yeah. But you could envision, let me just ask you, could you envision a time where the government would be justified in saying, look, temporarily we need to restrict the movement of people because of some sort of pandemic, such as if a dirty bomb was released over a particular city in this country and it was so contagious that it had a 98% kill rate. Do you think that the government has the right, or whatever you want to call it, to restrict people temporarily in that format?
Well, the government has the only thing that enforces rights to begin with. So it's not even a right. It's that the government has the capacity to do that, and you can't do a damn thing about it. Well, so that's the fact, right? So it's not like that's not fair, I'm going to hold up my sign and make a post, right? The reality, Rob, is that the force wins. And if force wins, the only real question is, well, what's informing how and when to use force adequately? Now, the reason I bring this up is because if it all comes down to adequate use of force of self-actualizing men who can defend or use aggression, we're talking about women. So I wanted to bring it back to voting, Rob. Did you agree with my opener that voting is a temporary transaction that a man, when a man votes, right, or a collection of men vote, what they're doing is they're putting aside their immediate brute force option and they're trading it for brute force option at the end that's enforcing the policies that they're voting for. Is that fair?
No, I don't think that's all that voting is, because I think there are men that are incapable or unwilling to use brute force that still vote.
Okay, gotcha. That's a good point. It kind of goes in my direction, is that, but for the men who could collectivize and use blocks of brute force, instead of doing that, wouldn't you say voting for them is an agreement to then use a voting block to influence policy, which on the tail end is buttressed and enforced by the threat of force.
Well, yes,
That's
but
tail
you are correct that no matter what we vote for, that there is through the point of a gun at the end of the day with the government, which is how it's enforced. But real quick, before I leave you go, the word collectivizing is doing a lot of work there, because I think one of the failures in your argument is going to be that it's not just the ability to use brute force that ends up in the most force possible that's able to convince people to do things. There are other things that aren't brute force, some of which women might be quite capable of.
Manipulation,
or it's the negative spin on saying persuasion.
Right. Well, men could manipulate too, so I'll grant all the ways. I'm granting all the ways in which things could be manipulated socially, shaming. In the end, though, you would agree that a vote itself is a trade of one type of force potentiality for another, right? That's fair?
The word it's define the word force. Or do you just mean like physical? No, I mean, do you just mean like physical aggression force, or like is there a form of force that's like financial manipulation? I could force you out of your home by
will to power, brute force, not soft force, not manipulation.
So you mean like force. Physicality?
Yeah, I'm saying that voting, the agreement to vote, right, for a bunch of people, the agreement to vote is an alternative to another option called let's get together and use threats of violence and actual force. It seems like a weird thing to not concede that voting is a conflict resolution apparatus in place of brute force.
It's not just voting, though. Right? Like even if I grant your premise here, voting is a mechanism through which what you're actually talking about occurs, which is the idea to collectivize as a government, right? So if you go back to like historical times, what governments actually began as, it was sort of a collectivization of people that said, hey, if we all come together and specialize and give a little bit up, then we'll end up better as a group.
Okay, perfect. That's actually better. So I would reframe it to fit your assessment, which is when a group of men, either individuals or collective, vote for a certain thing, what they're doing is instead of them forming another competing government, they're using a vote in place of forming a government to counter the actual government, and they're using a vote to buttress up the current government, right? So now you're talking about whether or not men are currently forfeiting their ability to form another competing government, right? Because that's what you basically just said. If a group of men vote, would you say they're voting that an alternative to voting could be rising up with guns and forming their own government?
Sure, there could be a lot of alternatives to that specific vote and a lot of alternative to government or isolation from the government. Now, I will say, I'm happy to leave you continue down this line of questioning. Yep. However, I'm not a lefty that's going to leave you walk all over me, and I'm going to control the direction of this at some point. But I'll let you go with it. I'll let you control the direction for now.
The only way I can move along is that if you grant or concede that voting is a form of offsetting or mitigating immediate brute force among men, and they're appealing to existing government.
I don't think that that's the only option, but it is certainly an option to say that voting is a way to ensure that it's just not like pogroms or instant use of force to achieve what one wants.
Yeah, I would say it's a peaceful apparatus for men to use, where they appeal to a monopoly of government and force that's going to uphold the policies that they're voting for instead of them getting together and enforcing the policies they just make up, right? Instead. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I just wanted to get it out there what it actually is. Now, the question in my opening is, if it's the case that a singular man who's voting, and he's voting in place of the alternatives, I want to know what is it the woman's doing? What are they forfeiting if they have no leverage when they vote?
Well, they do for two reasons.
What's their leverage?
One, we're going to get into what your definition of a threshold of force, because you've already said there are certain men that don't reach that threshold for what you would say. So one, I think that many women do meet that threshold. And second would be you've already conceded that there are other things other than just direct physical force that could lead to more force. You call just manipulation, but I think people could say you could also use the term persuasion that wouldn't have a negative connotation, which women would be able to have.
Did you say many women meet the threshold of, say, equal force to men in like in a war situation?
I didn't say equal force to men. I said they would meet a threshold. They would meet an adequate threshold of being able to deliver force. Because so let me control the direction here for a second. We've already said that there are certain men that wouldn't meet the adequate definition of force, you would say, because if we remember, let me bring up your picture again. The first part of your, what are we calling it, a syllogism there? The first part of it says you need adequate, is the word you use, self-actualizing force. So because you've already admitted that there are certain men that don't have adequate, I think the incumbent, or that it's necessary for you to define exactly what that adequate self-actualizing force would be.
Well, adequate would be able to would be the ability to shut someone down, end their life, or take weapons from them. Like, that's a good statistic. That's a more individual. You like individual things. It's the case statistically, the disparity between a man who has no gun taking the weapon, whether it's a gun or a knife, from a woman, in high probability, like super high reproducibility, whereas a man taking the same weapon from a man is lower suddenly. And so if it's the case that the adequate use of force on average is that men can overpower women, how do we know this? Historically, a collection of men who organize a government and a nation, they defend it adequately. So invasion would be a good one. Defense from invasion would be another good example. If you paired a bunch of men next to a bunch of women, right? Even I'll ask you, Rob, if there's a country of who share the same values, right? Libertarian values, your values. One country, all of their army is men, and the other country, all of the army is women. Which of those countries are you going to live in if you share your values?
You're cutting out a little on me, but I think I get the gist of the question. I would say that I think that obviously the army of men in general, though I think that but let me say that that's going to be not a good analogy for two reasons. One, I think that gap is actually closing. I think more important, I think your better argument would be not physicality, but because we're advancing to a point where technology through things like firearms, even drones, etc., make physical demand less important, still important, but less important than it was, say, in the 7th century or something. We could argue about it, but
let me counter that.
Real quick, Vic, I have a point to get to.
No, hold on. Let me counter that one thing. That's just reallocating the brute force of men to some other position, which includes machining, carrying large missiles around. The drone chicks who are in Burbank and they think they're playing a video game is really not a good hypothetical to use to try to equalize, to say that technology equalizes the sexes. It doesn't. Not even close. It's not even close to equalizing the sexes.
It's not a matter of equalizing. The word you used wasn't comparative. It was adequate self-actualization. So you take a clever trick there. When we're talking about self-actualization, what you're talking about is, as an individual, can you protect yourself from other individuals? And then the examples you start to give, we'll get to disarming a woman with a gun versus disarming a man with a gun. I'll get to that in a second. Other than that, the examples you give are, what about a military of men protecting against a military of women, which would be better? But that gets away from the point of adequate self-actualization. I would argue today, and remember, your point is it would only be a freak woman, possibly, like the fringe of the fringe, that would have, quote, adequate self-actualization of force. Correct? That's what you're saying. It would be like less than a percentage point of a percentage point when you say a freak.
It's an exception to the rule, but we're talking about rules here. So I would ask you, Rob, if it is adequate, why would you choose the men and not the women? It sounds like you could choose either or and you'd be fine.
No, it doesn't, right?
Why?
Different than saying which would be superior.
So
it's a different question. Again, the incumbent... Now listen.
Hang on, guys. Hang on, listen. This is beginning to stray away from the topic a bit, and instead it's becoming kind of a pedantry debate over the use of this term, which is fair because you did give a formal argument, and it's fine for Rob to dissect that argument. But instead of us kind of arguing past each other, let us take a minute to define the terms to both of your satisfaction. So let's start with adequate. I think, Rob, that is your point of contention, correct? Okay, so if you're saying adequate force, I just want to make sure that we're clear on this. Do you just mean the ability to impose your will with force?
Yeah. Yes, and adequate is in reference, in this case, to other men. In fact, so if there's some sort of gradient of adequacy, this actually demonstrates my argument that reality is patriarchal and hierarchical. So there's hierarchical even.
Well, hang on. Before we get to all the descriptors, I want to just make sure that the definition is correct.
Be able to do it.
Do you accept that definition of adequate? And if you don't, it's totally fine.
Yes,
right?
that definition's fine. I think that the descriptors he gives for it's where I'm going to have umbrage. So it seemed to be, if I may, it seemed to be that what he said was the way he defined what that adequate would be that can you disarm a man coming at you with a weapon? I think that is completely arbitrary. For example, if
hang on. I think you're right. But as far as giving, so one of the big kind of like debate games, as you know, is if there's kind of like tangential examples given to an on the spot descriptor or definition. That's why instead of us kind of going down the path of nitpicking the ideal of the definition, let's just get to the definition that both of us can agree on, unless we just can't agree on the definition.
Okay, I'm actually going to let Rob define it, the adequate, because
it's on you to define it.
But no, he answered a question that assumes he knows adequacy too. I'll tell you how. When I asked him the hypothetical between a country that shares his values, that is defended by women, and a country that's defended by men, him making the determination that the men are more adequate, he already has a sense of what that it's. So why, but why would you choose the men? I asked you.
That term more adequate doesn't even make sense.
Why
in this
did you
context.
choose the men?
I think men in general are superior in use of force than women.
More adequate?
I'm not using the term more adequate because it doesn't make, and I'll explain why. It doesn't make sense because the term you're using, which is necessary for your definition here, is just adequate. And so my contention, to stop beating around the bush, is this: a woman that is proficiently trained in the use of firearms, that carries that firearm with her regularly, is adequately able to protect herself from a man that is aggressing against her more than a man who is not trained in the use of firearms and is not carrying a firearm.
Okay, great. Does it follow that because that woman has the freedom to operate a gun and wear it and she's well trained, does it follow that she and other women are adequate enough to defend that right to own that gun and to have that gun on them?
Yes, that woman would be, if that woman would have an adequate defense. When you said that your definition is that, like, some attacker, that you have the ability to defend yourself from people that are aggressing against you, yes, that woman, when she would have that gun, would have the ability to do that. And the problem is, you don't have a good threshold. You've already conceded that certain men don't meet this metric. I agree with you. If we're looking at a world of 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, before we had firearms in basically any home that wanted one, like in our great country, that there was more of a hand-to-hand necessity to defend yourself if you're on your own from someone else. But in a world like the United States today, where there are more guns in this country than people, and there are many women that are trained very proficiently in using those guns in defense. And by the way, this isn't hypothetical. It happens all the time. There are women that fight off rapists. There are women that have fought off muggers. There are women that have killed burglars. So to claim that those women, that it's only a freak amount of people, you're implying here that there's somehow some need of physical brutality that women's bodies are incapable of having. And I think that the firearm training would be superior to that physical brutality in 90% of situations.
I got it, but you're looking at this in a very myopic way. For instance, you're granting them guns, right?
Sure.
Okay. How did they get guns?
What's it matter? Did you make your own gun?
No, but men made guns.
It doesn't matter.
Yes, it does matter.
No, I'll tell you why. Because you're talking about the self-actualization of force, right? Let me finish. So now, let me finish, please. Let me finish. Yes, if you as let me finish. If you as an individual created your own gun and say, that would be self-actualization, fine. But you don't get to say, well, in general, a man invented the gun and created the gun you're using. And so therefore, if you're a woman, that doesn't qualify as self-actualization of force. But if you are a man that did not create that gun, but by the mere fact that you have the same genitalia as the person that did, then you using that gun is self-actualization. Can you explain to me why it's self-actualization for a man that didn't create a gun to use the gun to defend himself, but it's not self-actualization for a woman that didn't create the gun to use it?
We're talking about the categories necessary, the distinct categories necessary for guns to even be possible, which is men exist.
It's irrelevant to the people that exist today. The woman right now, if a woman is born today And yes, and I'll explain why. If a woman is born today and then 18 years in the future, or we'll say 21 years into the future, she's gone out with her awesome father hunting all the time. By the time she's 12 years old, she goes to the range with him every week. She takes self-defense classes with firearms. She is incredibly proficient with a firearm. It is not correct to say, well, because when the gun was invented hundreds upon hundreds of years ago, it was men that invented it. Therefore, she can't have self-actualization of force. Your definition includes the necessity for self-actualization. And when pushed on it, you immediately go to the generalization. You say, but other men, and that's why your definition's erroneous.
Look. If we agree that when it comes down to it, the woman has no capability of using the gun unless it's made by men, whether that's true for me too is irrelevant to the point that men are needed and are in a different category.
Can a woman create a gun?
If there was a gunsmith or a metalsmith, a woman who's making a gun, talk about a freak of nature. They're going to be in the minimal. We wouldn't certainly depend on women, right? So me saying I depend on men to make guns, right? To maintain guns, to facilitate larger scale military apparatuses and weaponry, right? If that's all needed for what you're defining as self-governance, right? And women on wholesale can't do it. The thing is, I could do that. That's the difference. That's the difference.
The could doesn't matter. The could doesn't matter. It does not matter. With your definition, again, that talks about self-actualization of force, right? Like, so for example, now you're getting into a whole different ball of wax, right? Because you could say, there could be some dude that's like hulking, that's like one of the most badass fist fighters you've ever seen, but maybe he's not very bright, and he wouldn't have the first damn clue in how to create a firearm or how to use it. But he can carry
missiles.
Okay, but he wouldn't have.
There you go.
Let me finish. He wouldn't have the first idea to how to create a gun or even how to use a gun. When it comes to his ability, but we're not talking about things that. No, we're not.
Yes,
Your definition, it's talking about in order for you. It'll work better if you don't interrupt every 3 seconds.
Sorry.
I was generously. Okay, we're talking about, for the beginning of your syllogism, that you have to have the self-actualization of force to have sovereignty. So talking about what people could collectively do in a military situation, you could carry missiles. None of that is relevant to your ability to defend yourself and your property through the self-actualization of force. For the idea that you had to be the one to create the gun, to have the self-actualization of force to protect yourself or your property is nonsensical. And even if we accept that premise, which I don't, women could easily create guns today through things like 3D printers. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't think you sufficiently answer or even give even a remote answer as to why, if a man who never created a gun uses a gun, that's self-actualization of force. But if a woman who never created a gun uses it, it's not self-actualization.
So why is it the case that even you hold to a threshold, right, between a group of men and women and a group of men and women going to war, and you'd always pick the men, right? If the threshold. So wouldn't it be the case that even if we couldn't get to the highest resolution of the threshold, we would agree just generally together that men have the adequate self-actualizing force to take over other men and women, but women have neither?
No, I would say that what we could agree to, which I'd be willing to agree to, is on average, and I'll go further than that. It's more than just average. It's the preponderance. That on average, the preponderance of men are going to be better at these things than women. But again, remember, the core criticism that I have of what you're talking about is the fact that you're using broad generalities and saying all men and all women. And I think that that's erroneous, and that continuously shrinks when we're talking about your premise needing to be, for your syllogism to work, the very first premise is that you have to have a self-actualization of force. And I think there are many competent women in the use of firearms that could defend themselves and their property, because it doesn't just require brute physical strength.
Rob, so like let's take the Marine Corps or something like this. Now, would you agree that generally speaking, we'd have to say that the test to get into the Marine Corps has some standards, but ultimately it's like an invented arbitrary plan, right? Like, see if you can do this. If you can do it, great. If you can't, you can't, right?
Correct.
Even the standard set up is arbitrary, right?
Yes.
Okay, but it's still required to get into the Marine Corps.
Yes, I assume there's base level tests. Sure.
Okay, So,
Excuse me, sorry.
So I'm not sure why, if you're arguing, oh, well, it seems like an arbitrary threshold, but even you and I agree that the standard set for Marines shouldn't be lowered to match the capabilities or the incapabilities of women in the Marine Corps, right?
That's true.
Okay, so why?
Because what you're talking...
What is it about men
but
they can do it and
it
the women
is...
can't? Are we not generalizing that men, right, on net balance, men are capable, if they work at it, to, there's some percentage of men that could make it into the Marine Corps and pass the test, but there's no women who could do it.
Let me answer. It's bad form, but let me answer this question with a question. Would you acknowledge that the purpose of the Marine Corps, hypothetically, because this is a volunteer army at this point, we're not talking about a draft. You agree with that? Like people that are registering for the Marine Corps, the purpose is to have sort of the people that are really good at that. Like the best are people that are really good, correct?
Yeah, which is never a woman, right?
Okay, fair enough. But you grant that it would be, that's the purpose of it. Saying that one group of people is the best or amongst the best is different than saying adequate. Your argument hinges on the fact, in order to have sovereignty, which is sort of control over your life, right, is how we're defining sovereignty, is basically how we talked about it, that you need to have self-actualization of force. My argument is that a single mom with a fucking gun, when someone breaks into our house, can shoot that intruder and will have more success than a man who is not armed. And so therefore, I think that we could reasonably say that that particular woman has, because of the invention of the firearm, regardless if she ever created it or if a man or a woman created it and invented it originally, her right now have the ability to have the self-actualization of force when she has that weapon, and therefore she has sovereignty. Therefore, based on your own syllogism, she should have the right to vote.
Okay, so that one who did that.
You think there's only been one woman that's defended herself or her family with a firearm?
No, I'm just saying, starting with the one, right? So the thing is, if you're going to make a sweeping statement that all women should vote just because they're human, right? You're making the generalization here. I'm saying, well, interesting, Rob. If we actually set up a threshold of adequate force and you said, look at this fluke woman, she was able to shoot the robber, and then you ignore all the other times where they just fucking die and get raped, so, which is the majority of the instances when women. So when you see the YouTube, women doing the thing, and you're like, sweet, pro 2A, I love this stuff. That's not the majority. That's an exception. Now, even if I granted, Rob, okay, that one single woman, because someone invaded her house, she got a pew and it went in her favor. Now she gets to vote. It still wouldn't change the fact that on net balance, women are incapable of defending themselves or because if that were true, Rob, there would be a bunch of those women and you could order them together, right? And get them in a bundle. And you could say, you defend this state right here. And you could do that. But you can't do that, can you?
No, again, saying defend a state, we're talking about people that are volunteering to be the best of the best, right? And again, I want to go back to this. Go back to my opening, please. Let's go back to my opening statement. I'm prepared, and I've talked to you in your show before about the idea that there should be certain thresholds to voting. Now, my threshold is going to be much lower than what you would prefer. My default threshold is, I think that in order to show that you have the bare minimum to have your vote counted, that you, unless you have some sort of debilitating disease or you're serving overseas or something, you should have to show up with ID on voting day and vote in person. That is the bare minimum threshold that I think is practical, that we could enforce right now, and I think that would get rid of a lot of disinterested or low information voters that don't even have the energy to go there.
Who can
But
you said enforce.
But let me you can go back to this line of question, but let me finish my point. So that's a different debate than what we're having. I made it clear in my opening statement. The problem I have with saying wholesale women shouldn't have the right to vote is we're not dealing with sort of a meritocracy and saying there are certain thresholds that we need to have people pass for anyone then before they could vote. My problem is that you are denying people things like the right to vote based on immutable characteristics. And when I ask you your reason why, you give me this syllogism, and you have failed the first part of the syllogism. Let me, real quick, let me finish. I promise. One more sentence. And my argument, I'm more than happy to get on why I believe that the rights should be that we should default to people should be allowed to vote with immutable characteristics. But we're starting with the position that you wanted to argue. If you want to move on to what I want to argue, that's cool.
I just want to ask you a question. A 12-year-old boy the age that they are, the current age that they are, is that an immutable characteristic?
No, because it changes. Immutable means not changing.
Is their current age immutable? They can't change it.
Well, sure, they can't change their current
So it
age.
is. The answer, yes. So
It's not immutable.
No, hold on. It is immutable because they can't change their age by will, right? It's part of their nature. So when you say immutable, you say it means part of their nature. So if it's the case that a 12-year-old boy, his immutable characteristic is currently his age, and you're not letting him vote based on his immutable characteristic of his age, you would have to say that's wrong.
No, I don't.
Why not?
I think because everyone has a potential to reach an age, so when someone's born, they're not told at the moment of birth, you will never have a voice and be able to vote in this country.
So
right?
it isn't immutable.
So do you think? So then it is not immutable because it's ever changing, right? Even though you can't will yourself to change it in the direction that you would want, it is ever changing. So everyone has the potential to do that. You're not disqualifying some, and clearly it's okay to have laws like age of consent laws and stuff. I'll turn the question to you. Do you think that under your system then that you would be able to deny people the right to vote based on their race? If I could prove to you that people racially, for example, are more prone to not being able to defend themselves or more prone to making bad decisions, do you think it would be acceptable for this country to say, for example, Asian, people of Asian ethnicity can't vote, people of certain black ethnicities can't vote? Would you bite that bullet?
Based on just them having a skin color?
If I could prove to you that the outcomes of them voting would be detrimental to this country in general, would you be in favor of saying that we could restrict their right to vote based on something like race or ethnicity?
No, I would take the approach that you would take, and I think we'd agree once we set up standards for what it is to vote. Now, if they're
thank you for conceding the debate.
Hold on. No. If they're under, if they don't own land, no, that doesn't concede. All we did is say, well, if the argument is whose standards are determining who can vote or not, us both agreeing that we have different standards, but we're willing to impose those standards is not a concession at all. It's the fact that you're saying race is somehow equal to sex, and it's not. And here's why. Because sex, you agree, sex, there is a massive disparity between a woman's ability to use force and a man's ability to use force. So that alone, the starting position, right? You said they have a right to vote, right? You have a right to vote?
That's what I said. If you're
okay.
Yes.
Okay, so they have a right to vote, right? So their vote can send my body to another country, right?
Theoretically, yes.
Okay. So how is it their vote, they have a right to vote to send my body or my own children to some other country to die, right? But they can't even defend their right to vote.
Well, why not? You already
why
conceded.
Can't they? Because men. No, listen. Can men with guns right now take the women's right to vote?
Theoretically. Could women with guns take unarmed men's right to vote?
No.
Why not?
Because they're weaker. The same reason you
That's
would
not
choose.
true.
Hold on. The same reason you would choose to go to the man's country. No. You can't escape this. I asked you. No, listen, hold on. I asked you if there's two countries that share the same values, and one is run and enforced by purely men, and the other is purely women. You choose the men. But now in this instance, you're saying, well, women could just as well take men's rights to vote. Please tell me when that's ever happened.
It doesn't matter if it's
possible. You said it's possible. That
it is possible.
You can prove it. How? Show
okay,
it
I can show you easily it's possible.
Have
you followed any of the footage of the Ukraine-Russia war?
No, give me an
you
example.
You haven't? I'm giving you an example right now. Okay, so you haven't followed any of the Ukraine-Russia war. Then I'll explain something to you that's happening. One of the things that's quickly happening is drone warfare is largely overwhelming superior infantry. So theoretically, it would not be hard to envision a group of trained women who are giving military hardware of drones with such as machine guns, flamethrowers, grenades on them to be able to overtake a town of all men that were unarmed. It's easy to see that would
those are robots. Who made the robots?
It doesn't matter. It does not matter.
Does it not matter who makes the fucking tanks?
It does not once they have access.
It doesn't matter.
Okay, so let me, if it matters, Jim Bob, if it matters, then let's say this.
Who assembles the missiles?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, right? So let's say this. Let's say that tomorrow, Bill Gates has never personally made a weapon at all. Never. He's never even lifted a weight. He's never thrown a punch. He's never been in a bar fight. He never never gotten a scrap outside the fucking train tracks at high school. He's a wimp. He's a puss. He can't defend himself against anyone. But he decides to take his billions of dollars and buy a personal mercenary army.
Who made that?
It doesn't matter who made it.
It does.
Okay, I'll tell you who made it. Not Bill Gates.
A man did.
Doesn't matter. Again,
Yes, it does.
again, you are saying that you can't get away from this fundamental fact. You can't articulate why, because it's all about the
Rob.
individual. Let me finish, right? This is where we're two ships passing. Your syllogism
You're
starts
avoiding.
with the, I'm not avoiding, right? I'm articulating this
You're being a
point of-
progressive right now.
I'm not being a progressive. You're being someone that's incapable of understanding what I'm saying. What I'm saying is as follows, that you start under the premise of sovereignty is necessary. To have sovereignty, it is necessary for the individual to have adequate use of force, right? And then you say, if I say, but wait a minute, it's easy to see with technology, if people get their hands on technology, that they would have the use of force. Your answer to that is, but that woman didn't create
No, that's
that
not it.
weapon. A man
Let me
created
answer.
it somewhere.
I understand what you're saying.
Let
I
me
understand what
finish.
you're
I
saying.
don't think you do. I don't
I
think you
do.
do, because we
I
keep
do.
coming back to this. I've asked this question twice, so I'm going to ask it as clear as possible this time. Why is it that if a man who's never punched someone, who's never worked out, never been in a fight, never created a gun, if he uses a gun for force, you say that is an example of self-actualization of force?
Mm-hmm.
But if a woman in the exact same position who's never created a gun uses that same gun for sex to defend herself and her property in the exact same way,
Yeah.
you say that's not
No,
self-actualization. You
I would
can't get
say-
around it.
No, I would say in that instance, that's an adequate instance of self-actualizing force. That's not what's in question, Rob. Well, now, back to the tank thing. Here's the problem. I asked you, is it possible for women, a group of women, to take over men, right? And you said, have you seen the Ukraine footage? These women are using these
I didn't
drones.
say women were doing
Okay,
it. I didn't
whatever
say
it
that,
was.
but-
Okay, you said it's possible
Sure.
hypothetically to use drones, right?
Yes.
To use drones. They're using the drones. You say it doesn't matter where they come from. I'm asking you another question. Is it possible for a bunch of men to go in and and take all the drones and all the technology from the women?
It depends.
force?
It certainly would be possible. It could be
possible?
possible for women to do.
No.
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Okay.
It,
No. Hold on. Let me finish now. If you know it's possible for a bunch of men, because you're appealing to women suddenly have drones and Xbox controllers and they're bombing stuff. See, women could win too. No. First of all, they're using the technology that men made. Second of all, it's not irrelevant. Why? Because those things need to be put in places by men. So they couldn't actualize. Look, could they not actualize the missiles themselves? If it not for men using their force to put them together, to move them with brute force and put them into positions, put them inside the tube to be launched. Is it possible?
Again-
Could they do it? No, it's a simple question. Could the women actualize drone weaponology without men putting it all into place? Yes or no?
I'll answer. Give me 30 seconds. Yes, they could do it because there are machinery that could do that heavy lifting. In fact, it's not as if men are lifting these big missiles and putting them in silos.
made the
They are
machinery?
using machinery. Again, we get back to this fundamental question, which is you are saying because you collectivize people and you say that on one hand, self-actualization is what's important, that what you as an individual could do. But if a woman or man do the exact same thing with the exact same technology, you say it only counts as self-actualization when the man does it, because other men that he had no connection to whatsoever theoretically invented or built this stuff, whereas with the woman that didn't occur. It makes no sense
It does make
whatsoever.
sense.
It does not
You know
make
why?
sense.
I'll tell
And
you,
we're
Rob.
stuck on this
Rob,
point.
Rob, I'll tell you why it makes sense. It's because the reason you didn't answer the question, right, is because you know
I did answer.
actualization cannot be divorced from the thing that you're using.
That's of course it can.
No, it can't.
It is irrelevant how I
Look,
came.
I'll ask
can-
it again. You're not answering the
That's
question.
that is nonsensical.
Rob, I'm going to ask it one more time. A woman who's sitting in Burbank with a joystick and bombing people using massive bombs,
Mm-hmm.
could she actualize that weapon without men?
Yes,
How?
she has the weapon right now. So if men ceased to make that
hell.
weapon, she could actualize it without men right now.
She could make that weapon and carry all.
She doesn't have to make it. She has it.
No, she has it. Why?
It doesn't
does
matter
she have
why she has it. She
Okay,
has
okay.
it.
Great.
That
So
you're
you-
the
yes,
point you're
okay,
making
okay.
it's a let's say humans cease to exist today, right? And another two alien cultures come down. You know, I don't know, I don't follow sci-fi that much, but two alien cultures come down, right? And one's physically stronger than the other, but the other finds all these stockpiles of firearms, right? And they start whooping ass. Would you say, well, they're not self-actualizing force because it was only because of human men that they could do that?
Well, no, it wouldn't be self-actualizing because they didn't actually make the thing, right? So it is.
It's irrelevant.
It is relevant. No, it is relevant because you're just saying, well, self-actualizing at some particular instance, it's still. Is it a prerequisite to let's say, an instance of the gun, right? So you can say at a micro level, the woman who's defending her home is actualizing something once she has the gun. But if you pull it out, right? If you zoom out, she doesn't have the gun without the self-actualization of someone else, right? So
The same is true of an individual man. Jim Bob, let me ask you this question. Do you watch any sports?
Not totally, no.
Okay, let's say that hypothetically you're a fan of the Dallas Cowboys, and I know people like this, and they'll say, man, we should have won that game last game. Really? What did you do, if you're including yourself in we? You think that's ridiculous when people say shit like that? We should have won the game? They're not part of the we, right? They're not a player.
No, yeah.
Okay, same argument applies here. Just because I'm a man and some other man did something great and created a weapon and some other man mined the fucking materials that were necessary to create that weapon and then some other man in a factory I didn't do shit when it comes to self-actualization to do other. I went to the store and I bought the gun. Then I trained to use the gun. Then I stopped the home invader using that gun.
Yeah.
If I do that, do I get to say, well, that counts as self-actualization because some other man created it? Is that self-actualization on my part?
Well, I would say it's. I like the analogy attempt, but even in that instance, the only people who actualized it were the players, and I'm saying women aren't players and men are.
That's okay. You could say some men are players, but that individual man that's using the gun that didn't create it did not self-actualize force. Under your definition, correct?
I already granted. I don't know. You got muted.
Andrew, you're muted too.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Rob.
Sorry.
I was actually just slightly tweaking your mic level, and I accidentally muted you. Go ahead, man.
No problem.
I'm sorry.
What I'm saying is that even if I granted at a particular instance where someone is taking what they have and actualizing whatever they have, the fact that they're using something else, right, now necessitates something that's not them, right? And it keeps expanding out. I think we can agree. The reason I asked you, Rob, if it's the case that women could invade and take over men, and you said using technology, that necessitates the men, right? There's no way around it.
It does not. It does not today. It may have necessitated the accomplishments of men in the past, but when we're talking about people's ability to use force today, you could easily see. Okay. And again, I'm going to take this debate in at least the third direction that I wanted to. How much longer do we have, Andrew, so I could at least get in one of the topics that I wanted to talk about?
Well, we started a little late, so we still have plenty of time. We still have about a half hour of the debate left.
Okay. So I'll wait until we get to like 20 minutes.
Yeah, I want to run this one more question here, and we'll try to move off this particular part because it's looping now.
Sure.
Okay. Same question. There is a country of men with drones and the ability to use the drones and make the drones, and there's a country of women who have the same drones, right? They have equal firepower, equal cartridges, equal amounts of people, but one's men. And you had to decide which one you were going to move your family behind. Which one would you choose?
I'm assuming, can we also just one little pet peeve I have to say they have equal training, roughly equal training as well? Okay,
sure.
Then the men.
Okay, so in your instance, when I ask you, okay, there's men could take over the women, and you said, well, the women could take over the men too. Okay, now they're fighting each other, right? They have the same amount. You're still going to side the men, right?
Correct.
Okay, so but why if they're equal in training? And
if all things are equal other than the biological reality of them, men are more, and it's almost, and I think one of the good points that you're not making that you should be making more, it's less, I do agree that physical ability is part of it, but I think the mentality is even more with men. That men, on general, it's certainly true that men have a mentality that's more protective and more. They're not going to be as passive when it comes to protecting themselves and their loved ones.
Great. So one more question. There's two adjacent nations. They both have the same drone technology. Barely any non-tech robotic technology. One is women, purely women. One's purely men. And you were to bet on who could take each other's weapons, who would you bet on?
I would bet in the men.
How many out of 10 rounds?
9.5, 9.9.
Out of 100.
999 out of 1,000 times.
Okay.
There is the off chance that a woman could. None of that disputes anything that I'm saying. Again, it goes back to this idea of the collective. We're talking about whether or not individuals should be able to vote. Or
do they vote collectively?
But they. What do you mean? Do they vote collectively?
Do we vote collectively?
Individuals vote, but it is a collective tally.
Yeah. Like you get together with people, like, and everybody gets together, and they all like vote for one thing and they kind of agree to vote for one thing.
Sure, as individuals, we have a shitty two-party system, so
And then
we collectively vote. But
And
again,
then is the enforcement of what's voted for using collective force or individual force?
collective force.
Okay. So if it's the case that the enforcement of policy through voting is using collective force, right? It doesn't really follow that women would have a say if they collectively can't enforce the things that they're voting for.
My argument, which you're argued against, was that for reasons of liberty, that each individual should be able to vote. And you said that women can't have liberty. That's what you said, correct?
They can't maintain their liberty.
You said they can't have liberty, and
They have
the
an
reason is because they can't have sovereignty, and sovereignty is necessary for liberty, and they can't have sovereignty because they don't have the ability for self-actualization of force. So all that matters for your argument is arguing the individual level. Does the individual have the ability to self-actualize force? And I'm sorry that it appears we're looping. I don't agree with this syllogism. I have a different interpretation. But I'm saying on your argument, I'm taking your own definition and proving why you're wrong. Because all that matters for the first part of your syllogism is the term adequate self-actualization of force. And you are conceding that women have that, an adequate ability, if they have an equalizer like a firearm. The reason you're saying that it doesn't count in that situation is because somewhere men created it somewhere else. But I'm saying if we're going to apply that to the woman, we should also apply it to the man. Does a man have the self-actualization of force necessary to stop an armed gunman if he didn't create the gun? Just this individual. Don't look at it collectively. Rob Knorr here. I didn't create the gun. I didn't mine the gun. So when I use the gun to defend my property, and let's just say for this hypothetical that without the gun, I have 0% chance. 0% because this person's physically stronger than me and is armed. So I would have 0% chance. Does that mean if I use the gun to stop him that I did not self-actualize a use of force?
Rob, you keep going back to the particular. You've already conceded, Rob, that enforcement of votes and policy happen at the collective.
It doesn't matter for the use of your syllogism as to saying the women can't have liberty because they can't self-actualize force. You're now making a separate argument. You're not saying it the collective with your syllogism. You're saying self-actualization of force, not collective use.
If collectively, you need a collective of men who are individuals who can actualize the use of force to uphold and enforce policy that's voted on, right? And women can't do that, right?
Sure they can.
No, they can't. You think we could swap all of our men who enforce policy with women, and our country would maintain coherency?
No, it wouldn't be the same level. But again, there's two levels to this. We didn't even get to it. One, okay, I have three things to say about this. This is completely a different argument than the argument you started with, which to me seems to be an admission that you know that there's problems.
No, it's a magnitude. No, it's not, Rob. It's an order of magnitude. Look, if it's the case that men collectively, that your society of liberty requires groups of men, a group of men to enforce. And I'm asking you, could women do that? Could women collectively swap out with men today, right? The enforcement arm, the applicator, could they all be women? And we would maintain, and you admitted, no, it wouldn't be the same adequate force. I'm asking you, would a group of women serving as the pure arm of enforcement in our governance, is that adequate force to uphold our government?
Yeah, probably not.
Great.
Okay, but again,
on that basis, I don't think they should be able to vote.
Okay, listen. So that's a completely different rationale than you first gave, and there's a lot of things to say about it. For example, one of the things we talked about was the ability to persuade. Oftentimes, more important, although it is necessary to have the grunts on the ground that are doing things largely, it's becoming less and less necessary with the advent of technology and the ways we're seeing it. So you could do things more remotely, which means that physicality isn't necessary. And it's been the case for a long, long period of time that the people that use the persuasion actually have the ability to use force more effectively than the individuals that make up the collective of the men that are that defense force. So having a silver tongue and being able to persuade people actually means that you're able to use more use of force than just being an individual that's there. And certainly there are women historically and even today that would be capable of doing that. So again, that would mean that they would have this use of force. Now we're probably about the 20-minute mark, so I'd like to move on to the one section that I wanted to talk about.
if you took your best persuasive woman, some plant who's using her sexuality and her whispers,
Sure.
isn't it the case that force would still defeat that person, even if they were a man or a woman?
Well, hypothetically, but you can
you
say
could
that
just
about
take
any
them-
man or woman.
Yeah,
That's,
you
that's
just take
irrelevant.
them out. So
But
I don't
you can
think
say that about anything, isn't it?
Yeah, but men can be persuasive too, so it's not a good argument in defense of women, because men could use status and notoriety
that's
to
not
manipulate.
but
The
again,
question isn't hold on, Rob, stop interrupting. Can you use persuasion alone to uphold the liberty and freedom and sovereignty that you value so much?
it doesn't matter if it's persuasion alone. If the most effective tool,
That doesn't answer the question.
it
Rob.
certainly does.
I said, can you use that alone?
I will answer this question on the condition. I'll answer it with a yes, no on the condition. You answer the following question with a yes, no. Fair enough?
Fine.
Okay. No. Okay, my question to you is, in a world
You didn't
where
answer it.
I just said no.
Okay.
That is a literal yes, no
no.
answer.
Oh, you
Okay.
said no.
No, I said no. Okay. Now, given that in a world where we have so much technology such as firearms and things like that, is physical capability alone able to overthrow a government?
Physical capability
Correct.
of using technology?
No. Physical capability, your physical buffness, your ability to fight.
Yeah.
That alone could overthrow a government.
If you're appealing to technology, can you rephrase your question? There's
Yes.
a bunch of technology.
In a world where we have like armies with guns and missiles and warships and tanks, could some dude, just a bunch of dudes that are buff that don't have access to that through their physicality, overthrow governments like that?
No, if it's man versus man, right? The men who built the technology and the big scary missiles and carry them onto the Navy ship and everything else, who built and maintained the tanks, those men are superior. The argument isn't whether or not there's a patriarchal, hierarchical reality where force wins, and that includes men winning against other men. That's obvious. What we're saying is that if you took your top butchiest women with the bluest hair, Rob, the bluest hair, and you gave them all of the training and all of the free technology. They didn't have to build it. All the men did it for them, and they just granted them missiles and all the planes. And you took a bunch of dudes who had not as much of the military equipment. I would still bet on the men eventually winning.
Betting on the men is one thing. You seem to imply that you pushed me into this bad analogy where I had to answer a simple yes, no, if persuasion alone could do something. No, you concede similarly physical aggression or physical ability alone couldn't do it in the world of technology. So you're in the same position as me. Once you start to expound upon it, I can make the same sort of expounding when I talk about persuasion.
I didn't say that. No, Rob, I made it very clear. You cannot separate brute force and brute strength from the creation of that military equipment.
Yes, you can. You can't separate. Could you? Okay, but then you can't separate persuasion and intelligence from the creation of that, because someone had to persuade those people to come together to work together to create firearms. Correct?
I already told you that persuasion could happen with men and women. It's irrelevant to whether or not Rob, it's irrelevant to whether or not brute force is a necessary precondition to make large tanks and missiles.
Okay.
Is it not? It's not?
Because it'll always go to this infinite regression where you say because of the inventions of men 400 years ago, that means that only men could have self-actualization.
How does making a missile and large missiles and large tanks not necessitate the brute force of men?
So you mean like they have to physically lift the missiles and things of that nature?
Uh-huh.
Okay, machinery? How do you think they get it?
No, that just changes the technology.
Who makes that? Again, other women, people
No.
make machinery. Again, you're playing this step that's like somewhere there's a factory worker that's a man, right? There are factory workers that are women too. Of course, on average, they're more men. I'm going to get to the shit I want to talk to now. So if you want to keep
rivets, we're not talking about Rosie the
I think
Riveter.
I've been incredibly generous in sticking on exactly what you wanted to talk about, right?
I'm okay.
So I wanted to get to the third part of this. Will you concede this, that there is zero chance anywhere in the near future that we have this country, women cease to vote?
Do you think I think it's possible where there's a time where women cease to vote?
In like any time in the near future?
Yeah. I hope to see that in my lifetime.
Okay,
voluntarily.
But give me your best case scenario for how long you think it would take, being as optimistic as possible.
4 generations.
Okay, so you're talking like 50 years, maybe 60 years?
Yeah, I mean, if we could push it to like 40. That would be a really fun game to play.
How do we get there?
How do we get there?
Yes.
Well, it would be a combination. One I would use on women because their subject to it is a lot of propaganda. I would argue that what's best for them, like they knew during suffrage, what's best for them is to not vote. What's best for them is to focus on being good human beings, because a society that thrives, even under your liberty above all paradigm, requires people that are good. And those people, those good people, are raised by good mothers, and those mothers are not out doing OnlyFans and working for Nike in a cubicle, right? So I would use a combination of persuasion. I might even use women voting to eliminate their own vote, because that was the start of it. The irony is that the suffrage movement had to shut down. Susan B. Anthony had to shut down the voices of women, which is ironic, who were saying, we don't want this. We don't want this. Okay. So ideally, Rob, it's actually a persuasive argument first for women, because I do think culture influences. However, I would not be opposed at all if the government was somehow infiltrated by Christian ethicists who were men who just said, you know what? We're going to pass this thing, whether we do it by force or whether we do it by separating ourselves from the current democratic system, or by passing a bill that basically eliminates women voting altogether.
Okay, so the first part, there's two separate arguments there. I'm glad you got to that second part, because it drastically changes what I was going to talk about. On that second part, just for clarification, you would also agree that could take 4 or 5 generations before something like that would be possible?
Unless there was some sort of collapse, I think the default, if there was some sort of collapse, food shortage, resource shortage, electricity, I think the default reality would be women would not even be thinking about being in a position of like power or assuming their authority. All the loud biatches on whatever would be crying in a basement somewhere.
Okay, given that both of those strategies, which again, I vehemently disagree with, but we're talking the practicality of endorsing these sorts of positions that women can't vote and what that does for us politically in the near term.
Awesome politically.
I think that this is disastrous, particularly 50 days from election, to be talking about. And I'm grateful that people in positions of leadership are not endorsing these sorts of policies, because it would all but guarantee a loss in this next election and future elections for the next 10 to 20 years. Because
what is it you're preserving, though?
The idea that things can't get worse is nonsensical. Clearly,
no,
things
I don't
can
believe
get
that.
worse.
Yeah.
So, like, for example, I want to preserve watching your show and learning things from you and watching The Crucible. And if the establishment gets their way, they're going to completely censor the internet, like you see them doing even more egregiously in places like Brazil and in the EU. It's going to get worse and worse here. And so given that you think in a best case scenario that we're 4 or 5 generations, 50 years out from being able to actualize any of this, I think the best chance to be able to actualize the things that you want, and again, I'm disagreeing, but I'm just talking as a pragmatic way, is to run from announcing this position, particularly people in positions of leadership, as fast as possible. The more you advocate and tell women who make up 50% of the electorate, we ultimately want a society where you don't have a voice in the way our governments ran, they're going to vote against even the positions that would incrementally get you to a place that you think would be more acceptable.
Rob, do you accept that women voting in general may have caused the problem that you think is so urgent to fight against right now?
I could say in the aggregate, like in general, yeah.
So, yes.
If women didn't vote, wait. Let me be clear. Yes and no. The specific ones that we're seeing in the outcome that they've came, yes. Do I think that there could be creeping authoritarianism even in the position of this country that eventually would have came if we never had the 19th Amendment? Yeah, I think that it's certainly possible, but certainly it was probably accelerated and made more egregious based on the fact that how women have traditionally voted in the last 40 years.
Okay, Rob, my next question is this then. Is there a threshold at which things get bad enough where you would use authoritarian application to preserve what it is you call liberty or anything else?
There's always first off, you have to be careful with terms of service. So I just want to be clear here, because I don't want to get the Crucible.
Sorry, I don't know.
But I will say, in the hypothetical scenario, of course, you could envision scenarios where you would be willing to use authoritarianism because the situation is so dire.
Great, Rob. Okay, that's all I needed. So would you say that the creation of the ideals you love, the creation of the Constitution, is an example of that?
Yes, like the founding of our country and the sort of rebelling against.
So I
Brendan?
find it interesting that the thing that you value, the fabric of what you value, that you now lends itself to giving women equal votes and this sort of egalitarian approach, the very founding of it, the application used is something you disagree with.
No, I think that the scenario that we had there was a unique scenario, which literally called for the direct war and revolution against a country. Do you think we're anywhere near, because you don't want women to have the right to vote, that there should be a complete revolution and civil war in this country to prevent women from voting?
Are you saying that female liberation wasn't a deliberate subversion of this country?
No, that's not what I'm saying at all. It's irrelevant to the position I'm taking.
No, you're asking. No, hold on. You're saying, well, Jim Bob, the Constitution was this really unique situation in which the only thing you can do is the authoritarian approach of self-declaring your own sovereignty with the threat of force, which has nothing to do with voting. It didn't require voting. Didn't even assume the egalitarian standard of not only just men against men, but certainly not men with women. But now we have to preserve. We have to preserve women voting because we're avoiding something on the precipice here. What I'm saying is that if you permit it in one instance, I'm asking you, when are you going to open your eyes to see that we're in a dire situation right now?
Because in a utilitarian framework, even if I would concede to all of this, your advocacy for openly pushing, and I assume you would want national level politicians to openly be pushing this position, particularly 50 days outside of an election, would lead to the exact inverse decisions that you want. It would cause women in droves to be enthusiastic to vote against the Republican Party, even those that would agree with many other things that Republicans or Trump would suggest, which would lead to the direct outcome of a more creeping authoritarian in the opposite way, more woke outcomes, more abortions, more censorship so that your voice couldn't be out there, which would make it less likely that the cultural changes that you say would take 4 generations to be necessary would ever be able to occur.
Well, I don't know that everything you said would just be a necessary entailment or conclusion. I'm willing to look at how it is you extrapolated that far out to know the outcome, but I don't even need to look at the outcome to know that female liberation, specifically voting, was an act against women. Like, it's actually an act against women. They know it. They're starting to figure it out, Rob. So I don't know if you have your finger on the pulse, but women are starting to go, maybe we were duped.
What percentage?
I'm not sure, but it's creeping. I can see it.
I'm obviously not going to hold you to a direct, but like, give me a ballpark.
No, it's still small.
Right.
But the fact that even if it's creeping to like 15% of the population among conservative women, like that's good. I mean, there is something called the tipping effect. You know that? You know, like
I don't think that the number is close to that.
That's fine. I'm saying that what you think is required for that to happen is so egregious to you. It's so daunting and horrific to you. I'm saying, Rob, if it was possible that the best outcome was in fact women not voting, and your own wife agreed with it, how we get there, you would agree, is separate than that being something worthy of a goal.
Sure. So
Okay.
so you could say, if I were to agree, I'm not agreeing, but if I were to agree that ultimately the best goal would be to have women not vote, right? That could be something to strive for, but it still doesn't get, you still have to, would you agree with this, that the pragmatism of how we get there is important? That you would not want to make decisions that... Let me rephrase it. Let me rephrase the question, just so I'm being clear. That if you have an ultimate goal that you're trying to achieve, that the real world outcomes to getting you closer to that, or to getting the best chance of that being achieved, are important. And you don't push for outcomes just like morally or deontologically.
No, I understand what you're
that would
saying.
lead to the inverse.
I understand you. I don't say any outcome, any means possible. I don't take that approach, just so you know. But, however, when it comes down to it, isn't the most pragmatic tool force and the threat of force and authority?
Repeat that?
Isn't the most pragmatic way to accomplish a goal when in regards to policy, politics, governance is force? Is to acquire force?
It could be at times, but it's not always. Of course not.
Okay, but can you give me an
Do you
instance
think that?
of a,
Do you think that
hold on,
riot?
hold on.
Okay. Yeah.
Hold on. Can you give me an instance of a kind of governance that you support that shares your ideals that isn't entirely buttressed by the threat of force and
But
authority?
that's a different question entirely to what, yes. It seemed to be the question you asked previously was, if you're trying to get a goal, the most pragmatic or the most useful way to do so would be through force. And then when I say, no, I don't always agree with that, you say, but can you give me a government system that's not backed up by force? Those are two completely different questions.
No, here's the thing, though. Like, was the application and the declaration that people had rights, was that a choice for human beings? They attributed those rights to?
Yes.
It was?
Wait. I don't understand the question.
Okay, so government declares you guys have rights.
Okay.
Okay. If I'm someone who says no, I don't, and they say you don't have a choice, I'm enforcing that you have rights. Do you agree with that?
Do I agree that the government should have the ability to do that? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. If there's a group of people you can call a government, right, that declare for their entire nation, like the Napoleonic Code or something, right, that they declare via authority, hierarchy, down to the people, they say, you now have rights. If someone goes, no, I don't want that, right, are they not under authoritarian control and application?
Well,
the thing that you're avoiding.
I would say that the best case for your scenario here is that it's a paradox. It's of the parable of, like, can God create a rock that he can't lift? I would say that they still have rights even if they deny the ability that they have that right, because they have the right to deny that they have the right, which in itself is a right.
So, okay, so the thing is, if it's the case that you're in a paradox, I think it's an actual contradiction, not just a paradox, is that if you say, well, we got to avoid authority, right? We got to try to avoid authority. Now, let's say things were just going fine and there was no dire situation, and a monarch or government they just said, listen, I declare it so, you guys have these rights. And everyone, and a bunch of people said, no, I don't want these rights. You can't force these rights on me. You're saying, I'm not sure what your answer is, like, because that instance, you're actually accepting that as an authoritarian application while rejecting a different outcome using the same exact application.
No, I think that there's a misunderstanding of what I would be constituting as right. So the exact right that we're talking about here is the right to vote. So if I say, Jim Bob, you have the right to vote, and you say, I disagree, I don't have the right to vote, I say, that's fine, you don't have to vote. You could choose not to exercise that right. I'm just saying, as the government that has authority, you have the right to have your voice heard in this format that we call voting. If you choose to say, I don't have that right, therefore I choose to not exercise it, in effect, you have achieved what your goal is, because your problem would presumably be you don't think you should vote. You've solved that by not voting, but you can't say that I'm authoritarian by giving you the choice to vote if you want.
Rob, was it not an authoritarian measure to implement the 19th Amendment on women who the majority of which disagreed with it?
No.
Why not?
Even if they disagree, it's not authoritarian just if people vote for something that other people disagree with. It's not necessarily authoritarian. It only becomes authoritarian if the government is restricting people's ability to do things that they otherwise wanted to do. Those women were wanting to restrict other people's ability to do something that they wanted to do. So that's why it wouldn't be authoritarian.
Yeah, but to get the vote, they had to restrict the referendums.
That's authoritarian then. That's authoritarian.
Right.
If they did so through authoritarian means, that's different.
But I'm saying that the suffrage movement used authoritarian means to get this to pass. They blocked women from showing up to vote against their own vote.
That's but listen, those are two different questions. The first is a hypothetical of if women don't want women to have the right to vote, but the vote comes out that women have the right to vote, was that authoritarian against those women? No. The second scenario is, but the way this occurred practically was they had to cheat. They had to physically bar certain women from being able to vote. Yes, that action, that forcing the women to not be able to vote against the right to vote, is itself an authoritarian action. But that's different than what we're talking about now. The historical nature of how it came about is different than the debate we're having, which is twofold at this point. One is, ought women have the right to vote, not how did it come into effect? And the second is advocating for these positions not only hurting all sorts of important issues because it'll drive women to vote against MAGA, populism, etc., but is it also detrimental to the very goal that you've set of getting women to not
vote? Gentlemen, I actually have to wrap the debate there and get into closing statements. The reason is because you have time for closing statements, and then we have to get to everything else in the show. There's still going to be plenty more debate to go. It's just that this portion of it is going to be closed after the closing statements, and we'll allow super chats, caller participation, all that stuff. Now, Rob, you did open first, right? So because of that, I'm going to give you the last close. Okay. So Jim Bob, I'm going to give you the first close. Go ahead.
Sure. I'm glad Rob showed up. I'm glad he engaged with the argument that I laid out, the syllogism. I think that based on his cross-examination, I'm actually going to go back to the drawing board because I do have to make the distinction between a particular instance and a macro instance. Now, I did come to the conclusion that something like voting or upholding people's rights or some sort of justice system, it is fully dependent on a collective body of enforcement and primarily of men. And the fact that the same body of enforcement made up of women would be inadequate. Now, Rob says it is adequate that you could get a bunch of women to completely swap with men and uphold the rule of law, law and order. I think that's demonstrably false. All you have to do is look at a bunch of footage of female cops getting literally flipped on their head by homeless people. Now you just extrapolate that out, it's going to be a disaster. As far as the paradigm itself, I think the paradox that I exposed is that even Rob's view, there's ultimately a threshold in which authoritarianism is justified because the very notion of the Constitution was just that. It was men with guns stating the fact about reality, declaring it so, and willing to die and enforce it with the use of guns. There was no women around doing that. They wouldn't say, wait a second, do you think we should get Sally to vote on this? No, that's not how shit happens. That's not how shit's defended. That's not how shit's taken. Basically, you need men all the time. I think I demonstrated basically wholesale that even if you tried to equalize men and women with technology, you're still relying on men to create the technology. So is it really equal? If you give women the right to vote and the right to do this and the right to do that, if it's completely enforced by men collectively, do they really have those rights? Well, the answer is no. You could just take them away. They gave the Iranian women rights to vote and other things, and they were like, well, that was a mistake. Rights don't really exist. Now, if we got into it, metaphysics itself would be another defeater, I think, is because Rob couldn't actually execute an argument or a demonstration that showed me that rights exist. They'd merely be the privileges allotted to people, whether or not individuals or groups of people or classes, based on force. Based on men with force saying, you get this, you don't get this. That's just if he finds that unfortunate about reality, I don't know where he's going to go, because that same reality of men with guns and force, the threat of force, is the exact thing that maintains his illusion of liberty that he has right now. Everything he values, everything he loves about the United States, freedom, guns, it's all buttressed wholly by the will and the strength of men who are willing to die, get hurt, or kill to maintain that as a status quo. The idea that women have something to offer in the exchange called voting, which I established is a forfeiting of immediate brute force in exchange for latent brute force, at the tail end of policy. Now, if the man is trading their immediate brute force, whether it's collective or individual, to fight against the government, and they're exchanging that force for another type of force, I couldn't get a straight answer from Rob is, what is it the woman is actually exchanging in that transaction? I don't think it's a fair transaction. She has nothing to offer. She's allotted protection. She's allotted privileges, and she has no obligation to defend them because she can't. Now, the determination that some chick with a gun could fight off a robber is not the same thing as a bunch of women getting together and overtaking a male government and replacing it somehow. It's impossible. You'll never show it to me, even with the best video game style bombs and drones. It's not going to happen. Lastly, I would say that I find it paradoxical that, just go back to it, that Rob himself runs a nation. It's called his house. We love him for it. Rob is based in his house. We love him for that. Rob runs his household from a patriarchal view, from a hierarchical view. What he says goes. It's not equal. It's not equal. He's not going to do a vote. He's not going to drop little voting things in the little laundry chute and go and have the kid check it out and count the votes. No, what Rob says goes in his house, and his wife loves that about him. Now, we just have to convince women that that's what they really want, because they were confused, okay? Now, getting women to not vote anymore, I agree with Rob. It's actually most likely going to be a persuasive propaganda machine that does that. However, if it's necessary, I would use force. And I think so would Rob. We just have different thresholds of when we decide time is time. Okay. He wants to preserve the illusion of freedom and egalitarianism, even though it's a complete lie. He wants to defend Enlightenment values, right? He wants to defend the Constitution. He wants to defend all these things. They're all withering away because you're letting women who have a false sense of status vote. They're literally tearing apart everything you call liberty through their voting. And it's not enough for you, right? I don't know when it's going to be enough, but unfortunately for Rob, it'd probably be too late if we all took his approach to this problem. With that, I do appreciate Rob coming. We gave a good show. Andrew, thanks for the inviting me back on to do this, and thanks for everyone watching. I really appreciate the engagement and stuff. And
of course. Now, Rob, it's time for your closing. Go ahead when you're ready.
All right. I'll try to do this sort of in the inverse order that we talk. So let me talk first about, I think that this is a topic, particularly 50 days from election, that I'm hesitate to broach. I really enjoy Jim Bob and Andrew. I'm more than happy to do this debate. But I think in general times, talking about these sorts of things could harm people in the party that's advocating for these sort of stuff, and rightfully so. You could understand by a large group of the electorate being told we're going to try to enforce policies that you're no longer allowed to vote would persuade them to vote for the other side. So I think it's a huge mistake that Republicans, conservative populists make all the time, where they have infighting on these grandiose issues like this instead of trying to kick the ball in the back of the net and get pragmatic victories in real time. I think that it's quite evident that pushing these things, that at best case scenario, including according to Jim Bob, would be 50 years to be able to start to actualize, that by pushing for this sort of stuff now and wanting it to be pushed at a higher level and focusing on it is a grievous mistake. You need to be able to persuade in legitimate and authentic ways over decades to have something like this actually come to fruition, and just coming out and starting off with, no, you shouldn't have the right to vote, you basically don't have anything to offer, I think is a huge mistake. So I cannot stress enough, even if I can't convince you of the rest of the stuff that I'm going to say, maybe it's time to put this issue in the back burner for the next 60 days, because I think it's doing a huge disservice to not only getting Trump and other MAGA politicians or populist politicians elected, but it's deflecting from the actual issues that will be so important to achieve the goals that people like Jim Bob would want in the first place. Because once we have internet censorship, authoritarianism, we're in World War III, etc., we aren't going to have 40 years to convince people to do this stuff as Jim Bob would like to see. Now, going to the first part, the argument that we used the syllogism and the framework that Jim Bob wanted to say why people don't have liberty. I think that it's an interesting syllogism, and we hyper-focused on the first part of it. And the reason for this being because if any part of this falls apart, then it falls apart totally. And he says that my understanding and my foundational worldview, that I'm a minimalist with the government, and I think we should prioritize, even though I'm not a complete anarcho-capitalist, I think we should prioritize as the default giving people individual liberty and individual freedom. He says that women can't have that liberty because sovereignty is necessary for that sovereignty, and you can only have sovereignty if you could adequately self-actualize force to be able to defend your sovereignty. And I think that I proved all throughout this that this was problematic for various reasons. One, he uses a totalitarian collective approach where he says that we judge people based on an immutable characteristic such as sex. And I have a huge problem with that, because I think that if we're going to do something like this, which I wouldn't agree with doing it anyways, but I'm open to the debate, and it's more persuasive to do so in a meritocracy type way. So if you want to say we have some sort of test that you have to achieve before you're able to vote, I don't have much of a problem as that is saying, no, because you were born a certain sex, you could no longer have the right to vote, because even if there are exceptions where you could self-actualize force, we say as a collective, women can't. I think that that is incredibly detrimental and incredibly a bad way to run things, and it's easy to see how this, with the wrong sorts of government intact, could quickly run out of control. And even if we take the pragmatic approach of, well, yeah, but it would require force for anyone to do that anyways, I think that the moral approach would still be incorrect in this sense. We should not be telling people that they aren't allowed to have a voice in the way this country is governed just because they are born a certain sex. I think that's a big mistake. Secondly, even if we accept the definition of self-actualization of force, I think that you can see that Jim Bob hasn't thought this through totally, and I think that there's this sort of archaic view, and I'm still not getting it, that because men are physically stronger, that proves that women wouldn't be able to defend themselves. That's disproven empirically all the time, because we have things like firearm where women are able to defend themselves and do so various times. We could see examples of it. Maybe not as much as men, maybe if they don't have those weapons as well as men, but they're certainly able to defend themselves and their property. It also takes out of account that there are men that are incapable of doing that as well. And so it just to me, it seems like he hasn't thought this through, and I still haven't got an answer as to why, if just because someone that was biologically a man created a gun, then a man that had nothing to do with that creation of that gun, who uses that gun, that's him using self-actualization of force. But a woman who didn't create the gun, who uses that same gun in that same situation, is not actually self-actualizing force. And he immediately defaults to, yeah, but what about militaries, women military, men militaries? Even on that front, I think you can see that with technology, that there are women that are in positions that would be able to be competent, that would be able to defend themselves. I mean, we're getting to almost a computer geek type military. There will always be a need for grunts. That's totally true. But as the war in Ukraine, Russia proves, there's so many horrific events where some nerd with a drone could actually wipe out many infantry people that would be physically stronger. And there would certainly be women that would be capable of doing that. All of that's irrelevant anyways, because what happens is in this debate, and I really enjoyed this conversation, I did, and I appreciate that it got spirited. I think we're fucking dudes, we're men. That's how it should be. You're not here to hold each other's hands. You should go at each other hard. So I'm very pleased with how it went. I really am. But we didn't get to talk about sort of my theory and my sort of issues that I had. We spent so much time on sort of the idea of self-actualization, adequate self-actualization of force. Women certainly contribute a lot. I think it's erroneous to say that only if someone has the ability to defend themselves should they have a say in voting, because it requires a use of force to protect what our government does. There are all sorts of things you could contribute. For example, you could contribute money. If you're a woman born here, you're still forced to pay taxes. That's your labor that you're putting in. And why shouldn't you have a voice then? And even aside from that, when he talks about like, well, men are the ones that are fighting and women won't, I could speak directly to me. The only way that I'm able to sit here and talk to you all right now is because my wife is taking an unfair burden of the labor in our household by being a fantastic mother right now. Her job is more important and more difficult than what I do. So even when it comes to soldiers, how effective would military forces be? We all want a society where people are procreating and having families. If you didn't have that woman raising that child that enabled that man to go off and to fight and to go off and to protect, so that woman is sacrificing something. And it's not that we're individual, like, although I am arguing for individualization, I think that the family unit is the most important thing. And I think that when a man dies in war, although it's easy to flippantly say, clearly that's the biggest sacrifice, the heartbreak that women that sent their loved ones off and sacrificed sending their husband, the father of their child off, that's also a sacrifice that they're making. So the idea that they shouldn't have any say, to me, is completely erroneous. Lastly, I'll say about the idea of how I run my house. Listen, I try to run my house in a partnership. There are clear defined roles that we have in our family, and I think that my wife would admit that we follow many of those roles that you've seen, but I don't think it's near to the level that Jim Bob's giving this impression that I'm some like iron fist fascist that's telling my wife everything she has to do.
You will be.
So I just want to make that clear, so people don't get the wrong impression of it. So at the end of the day, I think that although it's an interesting argument, I will agree that I think women disproportionately vote in ways that I'm not favorable to. I think that women should have the right to vote. We should convince them that traditional cultural family values are the most important things, and maybe they should vote in similar directions to how their husbands are doing. I think maybe a little weakness on the people's part that are saying that women shouldn't vote. Maybe you don't have your house in order. Maybe you're not convincing your loved one, your spouse, to vote in the way that they should be. But all joking aside, I think that that's the better way to go, because I don't think that there's pragmatically a way that we're even remotely close to getting women to not vote. I think that attempts to push there will drive women away in droves, which will make the voting situation even worse and these problems even worse. I think that using immutable characteristics to tell people that they don't have rights, such as the right to vote or right to have a say in the country, is a huge mistake. I think it's belittling women's role. I don't think that the only thing that should matter is your ability to defend yourself or your ability to defend the country, because we all have pivotal roles, and the most pivotal role that I could think of is a good mother that's raising children, and she's sacrificing her children and husbands as well when they go off to die in war. So for all of these reasons, I think that we should instead, if we're going to have any barrier to voting, it should be same-day voting. unless with rare exceptions of people that are serving our military overseas and can't make it there or have medical conditions, what they don't. And I think that we should instead be pushing the values that people like Jim Bob do so great, articulating over and over. I don't agree with this portion of what he's saying, but the values of Christian ethics, of raising a family, of being good fathers, of having defined roles, of being a provider, and of women being great mothers. I think that that's how we win, and that's how we wake more and more women up to not only one day maybe having them agree in number that we shouldn't have the right to vote, but more importantly to that, even if they have the right to vote, which I would welcome them still having the right to vote, they will vote in ways that will be great for this country and for all individuals, because we will win that cultural battle that shows that the way we should run this country and raise our children is one through the ethics that we talk about regularly here.
All right, guys. Thanks for those closing statements. Thanks for the spirited debate.